Welcome, everybody, to another episode of our Strength and Knowledge podcast with the R2P Academy. This is your host for the day, Dr. Josh Funk, and I'm very, very excited to bring to you somebody straight from the bubble in Orlando, Florida, while the NBA and the reintroduction of the NBA, I guess in terms of the later stage of the season and eventually playoffs. But Dr. Jared Boyd.
What's going on, man?
Hey, man, welcome. So, before we dive in today, tell everybody a little bit just about your experience in the bubble.
Yeah. That's a unique experience to say the least. It's been a lot of fun. Obviously, it's like, even without being in the bubble in the NBA, it can be kind of sporadic with the schedule and the amount of games you're playing and the travel. So now it's like, okay, well, the travel is out of the equation because we're stuck here, but there's just a lot of unique experiences that are happening in regard to the amount of regulations and stipulations and rules you have to kind of abide by every day, things you have to do in regard to checking in. But then just also the scheduling. You might practice at one facility one day, another the next day. So the schedule is kind of sporadic. But, with all that being said, the energy is absolutely amazing, at least from our group. So it's been a lot of fun. And yesterday, 2 days ago, the playoffs just started, the regular season just started with these last 8 games, but it kind of feels like the playoffs already. If you've been watching the games, I mean, we had like maybe 2 or 3 overtimes already, really tight fourth quarter games. So the energy is there. And the weird thing to me is like, everybody was saying, oh, well, there's no fans, so the players are going to be different and it's not going to be that intense. But at the end of the day, it's like they're competitors. They are there to win and beat the person in front of them and the team that is opposing them. So like the energy, the level of play, it's amazing. I mean, it feels like playoffs already. We're not even in the playoffs.
Yeah, and I can't say that I caught a ton of the games, but Kawhi and LeBron probably don't really need a single person in the audience for them to go all out. I did catch that game. So
yeah, I mean they've been really, really good.
Yeah. Well, before we got on this conversation earlier, Jared did say that he would do a little bit to share more of his experience in the bubble. So we'll definitely look forward to seeing that later, Jared.
For sure.
What I want to hear now, and I want the listeners to hear, is a little bit more about your story. Obviously, you've had an amazing path to the point now where you're a performance physical therapist for the Memphis Grizzlies. But what got you into the profession?
Yeah, that's always a good question. Whenever I hear that question, I always think, man, my answer is so different, because a lot of people will say, oh, well, I wanted to help people, or I had an injury in high school and I was an athlete, and then I had to have PT. And then from there, I got fascinated by the world of PT and rehab, and my PT was great. For me, it's neither of those. Obviously, yes, I want to help people, right? But for me, it's more than that. It was more of just throughout high school, being involved in sports, but also seeing other people be able to compete at the levels that they were able to compete at, but also when they did have an injury, the level that they were able to come back in regard to, it didn't even seem like there was anything that they were battling against. And so for me, that was always fascinating, that, wow, the human body is so robust, so adaptable, and it's able to change, even without any kind of surgical intervention. So that to me was fascinating, as though, okay, there's all these different strategies that we have, and it's like this art and science and blending the two together, and this investigative process, I think, as well, of, all right, well, it's up to me to obviously understand the relevant research and literature and things that have credibility, but also be able to understand the person in front of me and the experiences that I've had, and kind of merge all of those things together. And so that's kind of what intrigued me, more so than even just simply wanting to help people. But it was like, this is kind of what can fill my cup, or this is where I feel like I can maximize my potential of all the different sciences, right? The psychology, the biology, the chemistry, the physiology, like all those things kind of come together under this umbrella of reconditioning. So for me, that was like the biggest thing that drew me into this specific profession. And then I was able to see like how you can traverse so many things from, again, the rehab setting, but then also the sports performance setting. And obviously, you know, when I came to Rehab to Perform, which I would call my first true clinical job. I had a job before that, as you know, that kind of taught me different models that were a little outdated. But I think that was beneficial for me because it allowed me to see the things that were probably a little bit more truthful and more meaningful, and things that I should start to implement within my practice as a clinician. But truly, Rehab to Perform, I think, was the place where I was able to start to learn what my true principles were, what my heuristics were, and then be a better generalist when it comes to these physical ailments that people would have and wanting to get back to physical activities. I know that's a lot.
No, it's definitely a lot. And I think, you know, you bring up the word generalist, but I will always remember just the first couple months around you, and it goes hand in hand with your topic for our online performance rehab summit, which surrounded tendinopathy, right? Mm-hmm. And tendon related issues and the reconditioning process for them. So tell us a little bit about the differences between itis and apathy, mm-hmm. And why those are so important for people when considering a tendon-related issue.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I always go back to, and I feel like I'm kind of maybe known for this, of like semantics always matter. And so some people will say, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. Like we can just call it tendonitis. It's the same thing. And I always say, well, there's this consensus amongst the population. For one, if you're a consumer, right, the general public, the lay person, if you say itis, then it means inflammation. And so then that registers to them that, because there's a social construct that, okay, inflammation is bad, and it also means rest, and we have to stop the aversive activities, which is true to some extent, that yes, we may want to lessen the instigator that's creating the pain potentially, but complete rest, especially for tendon, we know is going to be negative. It's going to have negative ramifications because the load is going to be the thing that drives us in the right direction from a tendon standpoint. And so by saying tendonitis to a patient, to them it registers as though, okay, I'm going to completely stop. Once my pain is completely gone and diminished, then I can just get back to my physical activity and I'm good. But what we see is that, okay, they don't have any more discomfort perhaps, but their functional capacity has decreased. And so the cycle repeats itself again, and the tendon pathology, so to speak, rears its head in the future because they never truly restored their function. So tendinopathy is a better term to use because it essentially says that there's a decrease in the tendon's capacity to handle either volume or intensity for your specific desired or required activities of choice, right? So if it's a runner and it's an Achilles, you have tendinopathy. All that means is that there's an overload or an inability for you to handle the duration or the intensity of running that you want to be able to do, as opposed to it specifically being a tendonitis, which is more linked to its inflammation that is creating this type of process, and we have to stop running. So it's important from that standpoint because it changes the patient's outlook, but it also will then, I think, change the clinician's interventions that they choose, right? Because if we as the clinician have that semantic, we probably are then going to select certain methods that coincide with the semantics that we're choosing. So we might say, okay, it's a tendonitis, so all I'm going to do is an isometric. I'm going to do these very gentle, low-level exercises and activities because I don't want to flare it up, which is okay initially. But again, as I said, some clinicians may think, okay, if the pain decreases, the patient's good, but we know that restoring function is going to be the most important thing to getting them back to where they want to go to reduce the susceptibility of the tendinopathy recurring in the future.
Yeah, and I think when you think of interventions associated with tendonitis, unfortunately, you're thinking about things like anti-inflammatory medication, you're thinking about
Yes.
cortisone shots. And I think just by saying the word tendinopathy, sometimes you're automatically getting the attention of the
Mm.
person that you're working with, because it sounds like something they've heard before,
Mm-hmm.
but different. And then for you, you do such a good job of talking about the different, really the different ways in which we can describe where we're at on this tendinopathy continuum. So share
Mm-hmm.
a little bit about that for the listeners.
Yeah. So, you know, there's a model from Jill Cook et al. And this is tendinopathy continuum model that she proposed. And so it looks at three different kind of stages, or this continuum, so to speak, of where someone potentially could fall. And so the first stage would be reactive. The reactive stage she would say means that somebody has, let's just call it an acute or a flare up, where they're very symptomatic. They're super irritable, meaning once they get discomfort or pain, then it takes a while for the onset of that pain to decrease, or they can have high sensitivity where the pain itself on a scale of 0 to 10 is pretty high. And so they might be people that if you palpate or touch or do like a squeeze test that says it is the Achilles, if you go 2 to 5 centimeters above the calcaneus, then they might feel like it's very sensitive, very painful. They might have some fusiform swelling in that area because, again, it's very reactive. Then you can have the disrepair phase, which is kind of attempting to quote unquote heal, but it's still kind of symptomatic. I call this kind of the subacute phase, essentially. And then you can have the degenerative phase, which she would say is where we start to have these structural pathoetiological changes within the actual collagen itself. So the collagen becomes disrupted, the extracellular matrix becomes disrupted, the actual histological factors of the tendon are changed. And so this is where the concept of treat the donut, not the hole, comes from, because the generative phase would say, oh, there's this hole, so to speak, where things are kind of disorganized and chaotic within the cellular makeup of the tendon. And I call that just the persistent or the chronic kind of phase of the tendon. And so from that lens, it's kind of important to understand where people are, but it doesn't necessarily dictate 100% what you're going to do with the patient. If you look at it from a broad landscape, just an area view, I kind of just look at, okay, it's reactive or acute, or it's persistent or degenerative. If it's reactive or acute, I'm going to try to reduce or take away the type of the instigator, if you will, the thing that is provoking the symptoms, but I'm still going to apply them with some kind of dose to increase their load tolerance and then eventually their load capacity. If it is something that is a little bit more persistent, chronic, or degenerative, I'm not going to put all of my effort in trying to restore the physiology of the tendon. I'm going to help out with restoring the function, and you could probably be a little bit more aggressive because they usually have less pain than somebody that's reactive or acute.
Now, with that being said, I mean, you talk a little bit about this continuum of tendinopathy, but then we dive into phases of reconditioning, which is almost a continuum in itself too. So how do you apply some of the concepts that you just mentioned surrounding tendinopathy into a modern reconditioning model?
Yeah, for sure. So our model for the listeners are going to, specifically for R2P Academy, is going to be, and we kind of all discuss this and we share the same premise with this, is going to be restore. And this is a continuum, meaning it's fluid, it's dynamic, right? It's not very rigid and sterile where I have to complete every single exit criteria in one before I move to the next. So that's one thing that's important to recognize. But this continuum are going to be 4 distinct phases, if you will. The first is going to be this restore phase, then we get into the refine phase, and then we get into the prepare and the perform. So from a tendon perspective, a restore might be, hey, let's restore the person's range of motion or their joint potential. So potentially we understand that the range of motion might be limited due to the protective mechanisms. Even if it is a tendon, we can still have some stiffening that may decrease the range of motion at the joint. They might have very, very low tolerance. They might have these habitual tendencies that they develop from trying to stress shield or shy away from loading the tendon, if it's the patellar tendon perhaps. So we want to restore some of those basal low level qualities. Can they just walk without having an antalgic gait? Can they wake up out of bed and the first few steps be asymptomatic? So that's just the restore phase, improving that tolerance. Then we move to the refine phase where we're trying to refine their load capacity. So can they now start to handle some type of external load, whether it's isometrics, whether it's concentric, eccentric, there's some kind of external load, whether body weight or additional weight that they can start to tolerate. And then we might start to change some of their movement competency, if you will. And that's just saying, again, they're not shying away or deviating away from the load or the movement. If it's the patellar tendon, then if you're doing a body weight bilateral squat, they're not shifting or shying away from the symptomatic side. And then we get into the prepare phase. This is where we now have load capacity, but we have the rate of load capacity where we're starting to move a little bit quicker with a little bit more speed, a little bit more velocity, because we know that that can provoke tendinopathies as well. So we want to make sure that they can handle different speeds, different tempos. And then lastly, we get into the prepare phase. The prepare phase is going to be this elastic or this recoil, this true kind of stretch, shorten cycle exercises. And this is where the aerobic plyometrics come into play. So they're moving at these very kind of short coupled, if you will, activities in different positions to make sure that they're as robust as they need to be for whatever their desired or required activities are. So those are the phases. Again, it's the restore, refine, prepare, and perform.
Now, you did such a good job of putting those together, and in a perfect world that goes very, very smooth, things overlay with one another, but ideally within a relatively efficient time period, we're checking these boxes, we're moving on, and things are uneventful. What are some common pitfalls that you'll see, maybe even if you look to your younger years as a clinician, or things you've seen among your peers that are pitfalls when it comes to tendon rehab?
Yeah, I think for me especially, and I think just from talking to a lot of people, it's if you look at the research, a lot of it will say, it'll postulate that, oh, eccentrics is the best, so you have to do eccentrics. And eccentrics aren't bad by any means, but they aren't necessarily the best thing to do. Because as I just mentioned, if someone is acute or has this reactive kind of tendinopathy, they're going to be very symptomatic, very sensitive, very irritable. And so eccentrics are going to potentially overstress and overload the tendon and make them even more perhaps sore, this perception of soreness. And that can set them back even further. So maybe isometrics would be potentially more suitable for them at the beginning. So I think that's one important thing, is just to understand that it's not necessarily the contraction type that you're using or that's going to dictate the adaptation and the functional ability of the tendon to be restored. It's really going to be the load that you're using. So most of the research is now starting to come out and say, hey, really, as long as you're above 70% MVIC, let's just say from an RPE standpoint, a 7 out of 10, then that's pretty solid in regard to this adaptation occurring from a tendon standpoint. Now, I will say the caveat with that is that you also do want to make sure that the tendon can handle different excursions, right? So I don't want to just do isometrics. I don't want to just do eccentrics. I don't want to just do concentrics. I want to have moments where I'm doing all of those, because the joint where the tendon is involved or attached is going to have to be able to handle different ranges of motion, which will thus require the ability to handle a concentric contraction, an eccentric contraction, a isometric contraction, especially if we're talking about locomotive activities like sprinting, running, skipping, hopping, things of that nature. So I think that's one common pitfall, is just subscribing to only one kind of contraction model. And then the second that I would say is underloading the tendon again, because a lot of times we think that the tendon is, once it's pain free, and really for a lot of things in rehab, uh, once there's no pain, then everything is all good and they can get back to where they need to be. But a lot of times, the thing to realize is that we have to really, really, as I just mentioned, load the tendon at a 7 or 8 out of 10 RPE. It doesn't have to be all the time, and it doesn't have to be early on. There's going to be this sliding scale that's relative to the patient, depending on the presentation that they come in with. But it's just important to understand that load is the language of the cell. So from that premise, it's important to not underload them, because if they're underloaded, then they're going to be underprepared. So those for me, I think, are the common pitfalls. And then, I'll even throw another one in there, Josh, and I'll say that from the standpoint of like the biopsychosocial approach, right? Lately, I've been looking at trying to delineate things between different models, and I feel like with tendons, and really, again, just any kind of pathology in the body that people present with, that a lot of clinicians will view them through the pathoanatomical model or the kinesiopathological model. Pathoanatomical basically just means, oh, you're built wrong. So some clinicians may say, oh, you have flat feet, you have pes planus, you overpronate when you stand, right? Your standing posture, you're built wrong. So we need to try to change and recreate your structure, so to speak. And so that's the wrong premise to then look at how to treat a tendinopathy, because if you just chase that, you're not doing the thing that's probably going to yield the highest dividends or have the highest return on investment, which is loading the tendon. Then the second thing is the kinesiopathological model, which is saying you move wrong, and that is the reason why you have tendon discomfort. That's not to say that their movement might have changed as a consequence of having pain, because we know our body's going to adapt, the brain is going to choose the path of least resistance. But the big thing to understand is that they likely didn't develop, the impetus for the tendinopathy wasn't because they were moving a certain way, right? So somebody may say, oh, you're a runner. Well, your running isn't efficient. We need to change how you run. That's why you're getting the tendon discomfort. And so I think if we subscribe to the pathoanatomical kinesiopathological model, then we miss the mark on what's the most important thing, low-hanging fruit, first priority, first line of defense for tendons, which is truly restoring low capacity. And then maybe if you feel like those other things are contributory, perhaps you can go down that route. I know that's a lot, but that's like everything that kind of just came to mind.
No, it's good. And I think hopefully people can take some big rocks from there, and then they'll reach out to you after this podcast.
For sure.
When I think of things that people had a lot of questions on after your presentation in the summit, one of the main topics was TNT, right? Tell the listeners a little bit about what TNT is and how that kind of falls under that load and dosing conversation that you just had with us.
Yeah, so that is from Ebony Rio. She has a paper on it. She also has, if you look up on YouTube, she has a presentation. And so TNT is tendon neuroplastic training. And all it is where you're trying to essentially modulate the excitatory and inhibitory outputs to the tendon. So really quickly, if we kind of look back at like neuroanatomy, you have in the brain the motor cortex, which is going to be the area that controls movement, right? The execution of movement. In the motor cortex, we have the upper motor neurons. These neurons will send their electrical impulses throughout the axon and travel the corticospinal tract. They travel the corticospinal tract to the spinal cord, and then they will communicate with the lower motor neuron, which then goes to the muscle, have the muscle contract, and if the muscle contracts, we know that then applies a force to the tendon. What happens sometimes with persistent tendinopathy, as we develop these habitual movement strategies because of pain, and we're kind of averse to loading, it's sensitive, it's irritable, we're trying to protect it. What happens is that, for one, the inhibitory control is trying to to a certain degree, dampen the pain. It's trying to move us and shield us away from that area. But the excitatory output is still there because we're trying to perform. So there's this mismatch between excitation and inhibition, where inhibition is trying to protect, but excitation is trying to get you to perform. So you could think of it as someone that has they're involved in a jumping sport, but they have a tendinopathy. Well, the requirements of the activity of the sport is that I have to jump high in order to compete, in order to outperform my competitors. So I'm going to jump high, but at the same time, it's kind of sensitive. So what Ebony Rio likens it to is like your foot is on the brake and the gas at the same time. So there's this synchrony between excitation and inhibition. And what tendon neuroplastic training is trying to do is to harness the concept of neuroplasticity, which is all you're trying to do is regulate the ability to put your foot on the brake at the right time and then put your foot on the gas at the right time and move back and forth between those two without you having a foot on both at the same time. So now you have the ability to accurately modulate the inhibition and then temper the excitation. And you do that by using a metronome. So the metronome is going to allow you to have a better cadence to then say, okay, I'm going to go down on a count of 4, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I come up on a count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Typically, you would do that for 3 to 4 sets of 8 to 10 repetitions, and that might be something that you're doing early on where you're trying to refine or restore the load capacity, but also the movement competency, so that they don't have this aversion to load, that they don't adopt these movement strategies that aren't conducive. Because again, we're refining and changing the neuroplasticity of that neuromatrix involved in movement. Again, that's Ebony Rio. For people that want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into that concept. It's very complex, but it's actually really, really simple. All you need is a metronome. You can download an app on your phone. You can have somebody do hill raises. You can have somebody do split squats. And all they're doing is just going slow and controlled, and it forces them to have this ability to channel in the ability to make sure that the brain is sending the message directly to the muscle at the right time, and then we're receiving the sensory input afferently back to the brain.
Well, I appreciate that, Jared. And I think that's something we're probably going to have to dive in a little bit more to in a follow-up Q&A. There was just so many people asking about it. So I think doing a deep dive there would be really, really beneficial. Before I let you go back into the bubble world, what is the one bit of advice that you would have for anybody who is either in DPT school right now or is a new grad?
That's a good one. Man, I would say, especially if you one piece of advice, that's tough. But I guess for me, I would say like start developing your principles early on. I know we touch on that a lot with R2P Academy and our courses. And I talk about it a lot as well personally, but I really think that that's so important because in school, what happens is you're going to get inundated with a lot of information and a lot of different strategies and techniques and interventions and just essentially just methods. And then once you get out of school, you're going to say, okay, well, now I have this Con Ed money from the business that I'm employed by, so I can start taking all these different courses. And a lot of times these courses are going to, again, continue to inundate you with more of these novel strategies and interventions. And it's so cool. It's like, okay, now I can do some PRI and some SFMA and some DNS, and I'm going to take this Exos course. I'm got like all these different things, and that's okay. But you might not have a true anchoring point for you to understand, well, how do I, like all this stuff, how do I put it together and make something that's very efficacious and useful and that I can wrap my head around? So I would just say developing your principles is going to be really important because they really do keep you anchored. They allow you to make better decisions, and they allow you to not get this paralysis by analysis when you're doing your intervention or when you're doing your evaluation. It's like, oh, I have all these interventions, but I don't really know when to use them or how to use them. I have all these tools, but my toolbox isn't organized for me to then select the right one at the right time. And that's what the principles allow you to do. So you can start that while you are in school, looking at the commonalities, things that are relatively ubiquitous amongst different types of proposed methods that you're being exposed to. If it's something that's common and that you're hearing across different courses or different types of methods, that's probably going to be the thing that's the most truthful.
Perfect. Jared, before I let you go here, you're active on Instagram, and I know you don't mind having people reach out via email. So what's your Instagram account, and what's the best email to reach you?
Dr. J. Fit Boyd is the IG, and then you can email me at jboyd@grizzlies.com.
Perfect. Jared, thanks for your time today. I appreciate it, and go Grizz.
Appreciate you.